I forgot to record. Lauren, before we go any further, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I am 1 minute away from being on, and I apologize that I'm not. I'm Lauren Van Schilfgaarde. I'm a tribal member of Cochiti Pueblo. I grew up in Albuquerque, and I am now an assistant professor of law at UCLA.
Yay! Lauren is just incredibly badass. Okay. And if you don't know, that's okay. I'm Rachael Lorenzo. I'm the founder and co-executive director of Indigenous Women Rising. I really wanted to share our mission statement just very briefly for folks who maybe don't know us or don't know us very well. We're committed to honoring Native and Indigenous people's inherent right to equitable, not equal, and culturally safe health options through accessible health education, resources, and advocacy. I also really wanted to share our values with folks. Our values are our cultural cornerstones and they are not negotiable. We will always center Indigenous folks. We value community as a noun and a verb. We do our best to show empathy, support, respect, and honor the responsibility we have, and empower each other to use the information to make the best decisions for ourselves and our families. Accountability, integrity, trust, and transparent communication. And this isn't just for internally as an organization, but also for for how we interact with our community members. Hold on one second. Sorry, my cute cousin just texted me. Okay. The basics of the federal government. Whoops, no, hold on. Basics of the federal government. There are folks who maybe don't know how all of these different branches of government are connected together, and that's okay. We don't have to know everything. This is really basic 101. Great if you know it. Just hang out with for a few minutes so I can go through this part. Not everyone knows these things, and so I wanted to offer just a basic 101, at least of the federal government, to show that when you hear rhetoric on TV, when you see or you read newspapers, what you're reading a lot of times is rhetoric, and it can be pretty biased, but what kind of helps uh, put at bay some anxiety that people are feeling around election times, whether it's presidential election or midterms, is knowing that what you're reading and what you're seeing on the news is not always how it happens or how it plays out or is reality. And so just grounding yourself in the basics of civic engagement, I guess, can be really helpful in helping like deter you from feeling those negative feelings as much, because it's definitely it can definitely feel overwhelming when you read or see something. And part of the reason that I think Trump won is because when you say something enough times, people believe it and you start to believe it. And yeah, and his campaign was a lot of feelings and not a lot of facts. And political pundits who are kind of doing like a post-election autopsy are saying that as well. That appealing to feeling, uh, and on the plus side, storytelling can be really powerful, and that's what we do in reproductive justice movement. So federal government president has a 4-year term. They choose the running mate. They can have 2 consecutive terms max. Congress or Congress people. So we have 2 chambers of Congress, the legislative branch, Congress and the Senate. So every congressperson has a 2-year term. Their district is based on census data, and this is crucial information to know and a good thing to participate in when it comes to state legislatures and redistricting. Redistricting is so important, and it's also really important to ensure that tribes are included in that process because their vision of representation might be very different, and those perspectives a lot of times are missing. And so Congress, state legislatures, the census, and redistricting are all connected because that determines how many districts or how much representation your state can get in Congress. In the Senate, there are 6-year terms. Every state gets 2 senators. It's a 6-year term, right? Yeah. Ugh, from a political scientist. Okay. Every state gets 2 senators, and so there are 100 senators total. This is the legislative branch. The Supreme Court is a lifetime appointment. They are appointed by the president. And then that appointment goes to the Senate to be confirmed, and they require a simple majority, which is 50+1. The judicial branches I have here is not just the Supreme Court, it's the Court of Appeals and District Court judges. The legislative branch, as I mentioned, Congress and the Senate. The executive branch is not just the president, but also the cabinet. And so cabinet secretaries oversee the different agencies under the president. So for example, as it pertains to tribes, the Department of the Interior, which is where the Bureau of Indian Affairs is housed under, and the current secretary is Secretary Deb Haaland, who's also from Laguna Pueblo. I'm gonna pause there. Lauren, did I miss anything? Do you want to add anything?
No, that sounds super good. I'd only note that the cabinet oversees like these massive departments, and within those departments are a lot of political appointees, but also a lot more, quote, like civil servants or bureaucrats, people that work for the federal government, like the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Interior, that generally speaking, work regardless of the administration. So they're there during Obama, they're there during Trump, they're there during Biden. We see some transition, and I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch with the Trump administration. How many civil servants stay, how many are asked to leave, how many resign, how many are fired. I think that'll be a potential atypical moment of transition.
This is an example of just the appointment process for the Supreme Court. So executive branch, Trump appointee, Brett Kavanaugh, legislative branch, one of the chambers, which is the Senate. There were 50 yays, 48 nays, 1 present and 1 not voting. And so that's how this whiny loser ended up on the Supreme Court. The next slide is just like for funsies because it was ridiculous. When I was creating this, PowerPoint, I was like, oh, can AI create like a circle thing or like a thing outside of PowerPoint to show what I'm talking about? And it can't. So this is the don't always trust AI. It's not good. Okay. The party system. So party and governance and bureaucracy are very different things, but they overlap, right? As Lauren said, there are civil servants who work in these departments that stay throughout different administrations. So their job duties might change a little or their goals might change a little, but parties do and don't play a whole role. And having been in state government myself, it can take a really long time for something to happen because of the bureaucracy. And sometimes things might have to go to court. And so just keeping those things in mind, we have incredible, extremely talented, dedicated, compassionate attorneys across the country who are pro-abortion. They are incredible allies to Native people. There's an organization called the Native American, what does the R stand for in NARF?
Rights
Rights, Native American Rights Foundation.
Fund.
They have helped folks in litigation over the years. So yeah, they're just keep in mind that yes, parties suck and elections can suck, but also time can be on our side when dangerous bills or decisions or executive orders or administrative rules, when those things come up, because there are people with the know-how to get those things to court. Now, I'm all about abolishing the United States. I am. And at the same time, we work with the tools that we have. So for folks who might not be as in tune to like the differences between Democrats and Republicans, I'm gonna just go over like typically what the difference is. So Democrats believe in like using the role of government to protect civil rights, the environment, social equality, healthcare. I don't really know what progressive taxation means, so. Republicans are very much like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, lower taxes, pro-business. National defense is like a really huge one. Is there anything you want to add, Lauren?
Progressive taxation is the idea that you should pay a bigger proportion of your income in taxes the wealthier you are. And so marginal tax rate is a reflection of that, where everyone pays a certain percentage if you make it this threshold, so on and so on and so forth. It is considered like a social justice perspective that like we need taxation in order to have a government, but how like we could have a system where everyone just pays the same, but that would be less fair if you're paying a bigger percentage of your income than others.
Okay, well, that does, I mean, look, I'm all for taxes. I am. I just don't like necessarily what they go to. But that's neither here nor there.
I mean, it is to as like a pitch for taxation. But the other realm of my research is taxation in the way that this impacts or doesn't impact tribes. And right, like tribes are characterized as both a taxpayer, but also a taxer. And the extent to which the federal government and states are exercising their taxation authority, that's often in contradiction to tribes and to tribal ability to tax. And so this is another area where tribal sovereignty is absolutely at stake. And when tribes are denied the opportunity to tax and to set their own tax policy because they're being usurped by federal and state governments, they're consequently denied revenue for their own governmental services, and thereby the opportunity to develop their own policy to how to spend that revenue. And so taxation is everything.
Thank you, Lauren. See, that's why you have smarter people do this stuff with you. Okay, the reality of the feds and the parties. This is my perspective, okay? This is my perspective, my experience. I've been in politics for over a decade. I've been a political appointee. I've worked on campaigns. And being in abortion world has really opened my eyes to like the racism even within the Democratic Party. So a liberal, quite a quote unquote a liberal, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I'd want to include it in case folks might not know like how the term Democrat and liberal are connected, or like what party liberal is associated with. Kind of left leaning. I really feel like Democrats are more willing to lean right when pushed into a corner politically in the press during election time, right before polls close. We saw that with Kamala Harris and her stance on Gaza. The closer we got to election day, the more that she talked about a ceasefire. And the typical talking point is like a two-party solution or a two-state solution. They can still be very racist and xenophobic. Something I've seen on social media that is just so heartbreaking to see is that white LGBTQ folks denigrating communities of color, marginalized groups who do not fall into line, who do not vote, or who do not vote for the right candidate, or who are outspoken about their critiques about candidates. It's, for example, there was a tweet I saw from a white gay man who was like, all right, you Muslims, just like being super Islamophobic and being like, get ready to get deported. It was really gross to read. Republicans, I think Republicans and anti-abortion folks are extremely organized. Yes, they are very sexist, very Christian oriented, and very like pro-defense spending. Anytime any of the defense departments at the federal level submit their budget, they're always given more than they asked for. It's one of the top funded things that the federal government does, and it's national defense. At many times at the expense of healthcare and education. And again, like I said, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But I also would like Lauren to offer her perspective on this two-party system.
Oh gosh, I mean, that was beautiful. I would note that there's nothing in the Constitution that says we have to be a two-party system, but this was a norm established pretty immediately after the ratification of the Constitution. The founders, to the extent that is of interest to anybody, wrote a lot about the two-party system and immediately embraced it. They also immediately entered political crisis. Lots of other countries do not have a two-party system, and this plays out in lots of different ways. But I think one point of contrast is that you'll have a country that has multiple parties, say 5 or 7 parties. One of the reasons it's really difficult to do that here is because of the way, like we saw with the Electoral College, it's a majority takes all. So whoever gets right 51% or even 50.001% takes all of the votes. In a different system, you can craft it where that 50% takes 50% of the votes, and another party might get 30% of the votes, and another party might get 15% of the votes. And then they allocate seats in their parliament, their version of Congress, accordingly. So instead of having, 51% Republican and 49% Democrat, you could break it up in a lot more ways. I think that's interesting. I think Alaska actually has a really interesting process for how they vote. They have sort of rejected the two-party system, and same with California, at least in regards to elections. So you vote for your top 5 candidates and you rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so the number 1 slot might be split 50-50. But it could be that everyone ranked number 2 90%. There was 90% consensus on who number 2 is. That's who would be, which is considered to be a lot more authentic way of gathering who the majority vote is. So I think that's interesting. Just to comment that the two-party system is heavily influenced by the way we structure the government. And it doesn't have to be that way. even under our own governmental framework. But there's a strong normative push for it.
Mhm. Thank you, Lauren. How does this pertain to tribes? There are federal trust responsibilities to tribes, and I'd love for Lauren to expand on that in a moment. The President's Cabinet, the Secretaries of Health and Human Services, Department of the Interior, judicial branch appointees are incredibly important to tribes, and so they're going to be looking out for that. Federal recognition, tribal citizenship, and access to healthcare and land management, those are all very much connected. Federal recognition is important because it allows, I'm not saying it's great, and unfortunately, that's the reality for tribes, but for federal recognition, which can be a very long process and it can take decades. A lot of state recognized tribes are still fighting for federal recognition, and the federal government can pull federal recognition from tribes. But that really determines how much access to healthcare tribes might have. It also determines the kinds of agreements that tribes can enter into with the federal government. One of them being through Indian Health Services and the kinds of contracts that can be made, and of course, land management. I bring this up because in my role at the New Mexico State Land Office, I realized and found that land management and federal recognition, unfortunately, in this system cannot exist without each other. With land management under federal law, there's something called Section 106, which requires states or the Bureau of Land Management, for example, to consult with tribes. It's not always the best consultation, frankly. It's really crappy. But a lot of times oil and gas companies, even solar and wind companies do have to get buy-in from tribe, or they should be getting buy-in from tribes from the very beginning. And actually in the attendees list, we have Mayani Barudin from Sovereign Energy listening in, and one day I would love to like do a webinar with you because she is like a badass and an expert in environmental stuff when it comes to tribes. The census, our numbers in the census have grown over 27% since 2010 and the census before this last one. Tribes and federal jurisdiction plus the courts, really important because if a crime is committed or tribes need to litigate, it becomes federal jurisdiction. And so that's part of the reason why why the court system is really important. Blood quantum is, you have to have some kind of membership and maintain membership to essentially in a way that the federal government is like, okay, you have enough members. If we don't have enough members and our land is held in trust currently in order to have a reservation, we don't own our land. Reservations don't own our land. And so it's held in trust by the federal government, Department of Interior. And if we don't have any members, we don't have any land. It's a really messed up system. But yeah, Lauren, please add to this.
Well, there was a question if you could put your presentation in presentation mode so that attendees could see it better.
Okay, I'm gonna try because okay, I'll do it.
This is what the entire course of federal Indian law is, and so I could go way off the deep end. But I'd note for our purposes, there's a lot of scholarly attention on this, right? Tribes are not part of like the typical governmental structure, what's also known as federalism. Tribes weren't invited to the Constitutional Convention. Tribes arguably didn't want to go to the Constitutional Convention. Because of that, we're not, right? Like we don't have seats in Congress. But also because of that, things like the Bill of Rights don't apply to tribes. Tribes' sovereignty is considered inherent. It derives from the people of the tribe and is a source totally separate from the federal government and the states, which share their sovereignty and negotiate how to navigate that. However, the United States, as a colonial power, has asserted plenary power over tribes, and it means that they can pass any statute that they want about tribes. They can unilaterally abrogate any treaty with any tribe, and they can do that as the, quote, stronger, superior power in relation to tribes. And so that is a deeply problematic colonial structure. It is absolutely extra constitutional. But this was recently litigated in the ICWA case, Brackeen v. Haaland. That's what it was about. The question on the table was, can Congress even pass a statute like the Indian Child Welfare Act? Some of the critiques was that it's race-based, and so it violates equal protection in the Constitution. But that was ultimately put aside. It actually wasn't addressed. It's like a side of an open question. But they held, yeah, Congress can do this because Congress can pass any statute they want in regards to Indians. In this case, it happened to be the Indian Child Welfare. But I do want to just comment on the paradoxical position that tribes found themselves in. To defend ICWA, this really progressive human rights-based statute, this reproductive justice statute, tribes had to argue that, yes, Congress has plenary power over us and thereby has the constitutional authority to do this. It means that also that tribes, because we're sort of outside the Constitution, we don't have a great mechanism for engaging in this political process. Tribal consultation is usually a process sort of after the fact to help navigate that. But otherwise, tribes have had to build out their own lobbying firms in order to engage with lawmakers and push for other legislation to advance tribal interests in a really cumbersome process that doesn't really anticipate tribes as governments and conceives them more like special interests, which has proven to be not great.
Yes. Okay. Party system, race perspective, plus an example. I have Ruth Bader Ginsburg here with a red circle through her picture. I'm not a fan of this justice. She was actually very terrible for tribes, particularly with the Oneida decision. Really encourage folks to read up on that. And Lauren, if you want to give a brief summary on that, yes.
This is the Oneida Indian Nation versus Sherrill County, City of Sherrill, a New York case. It involves some sort of like antiquated statutes, the Indian trader statutes that I'm only marginally familiar with. But the question at the Supreme Court was, and I also to say there's a big history there that I'm only just like starting to learn about on the East Coast. The East Coast experienced colonialism in their own way, just like all tribes, but it often meant that it was very early and pre-constitutional, meaning they were engaging with the British Crown. And then the colony, in this case, the colony of New York, when it was operating like its own nation state as opposed to a state of the United States. And so they have treaties like with New York that make for a very important history there. All of which to say they had been railroaded and totally screwed out of their land for a long, long time. They were able to finally advance their claim in the court. And they were thrown out for the reason being laches, which is a legal way of saying you took too long to make a claim. And so like it's expired, like you should have brought this 250 years ago. But what made this case really, really problematic is that part of Justice Ginsburg's reading, she was the author of this decision. You know, their Supreme Court decisions run on like majority rule. And so of the 9 justices, if 5 or more vote in one direction, that's what the holding is. I forget what the count was on that case, but Justice Ginsburg authored the opinion, And the bulk of her reasoning rested on the character of the city of Sherrill had changed so much that it was no longer, quote, Indian anymore. Effectively reasoning that if colonization is successful enough, if people don't look, quote, Indian in the way that the court recognizes Indians to be, then their rights can expire, that you can effectively lose the battle. A type of reasoning that simply isn't applied to any other person or corporation for that matter. It's not supposed to be if you beat me up enough, it's no longer a crime. If you steal enough of my money, it's no longer theft. That type of reasoning doesn't work in any other context, but for some reason with Indians it does. And so it's the quintessential decision that really makes Justice Ginsburg disfavored among Indian country. She later expressed her regret for the decision. I think that she certainly heard how problematic it was. So something to be said, but she also was not ever leading the charge for Indian country in ways that Justice Gorsuch, a Republican Trump appointee, absolutely is. And I know I find myself, particularly in liberal circles, asked, if you could, take one justice above any, like who would you take? And it's like, I would take Gorsuch. And they're like, even given the Dobbs decision? And the answer resoundingly is yes.
Yes. Thank you for that. And I'm glad you brought up Gorsuch because I do have it on this list here. And then just really quick in the Oneida or the Sherrill versus Oneida case, it was an 8-1 decision with Ginsburg writing the majority opinion and Justice Stevens in the minority. So appointed by Democrat President Bill Clinton. And I'm just sharing some feedback that we've received from liberals, from folks who claim to support IWR's work and who have called us disrespectful to the movement for naming that RBG was actually not great for Native folks. And just even acknowledging that was really hard for colleagues in different like liberal spaces across the country who were like, but she did so great on women's health. And I'm like, look, Roe v. Wade is the bare minimum. We don't want it recodified because if it wasn't good for Native people and now non-Native people are starting to experience what we experience after the Dobbs decision, why would we want to recodify something that didn't serve some of our most marginalized communities? Like to me, that makes no sense. Also, as part of cultural competency, if we're not tribal leaders, we are not in a position to talk down to them and their attorneys, their appointees, people that they trust to advocate on their behalf, who actually appreciate conservative appointees like Justice Neil Gorsuch, who is the first Supreme Court justice to be an expert on Indian law. And Trump's appointments will largely not appeal to everyone, but we very rarely take tribes' perspectives into consideration when we're thinking about that, because at least in my analysis, tribal governance kind of transcends political parties. Tribes are really looking at how candidates are going to benefit or advance Indian education, Indian health, tribal economies and gaming, stuff like that. But yeah, I know you said you wanted to go over Castro Huerta because that's like your bread and butter. At least I think it's your bread and butter. Also, Lauren and I are both parents, so okay, I'll give her a minute. Oh shoot, nope. Okay. I'll let her finish. So the party system. Oh, are you back? Okay. Can you go over the Castro case, the Castro Huerta case?
Yes, sorry. like kids and dinner, and you all know.
No, no,
you're all
no.
good
I
with
get it.
this
I get it.
thing. Okay, so one of the worst things to happen in Indian country in the last 20 years. It really starts with the McGirt case. And Rachel stopped me because I'm gonna spiral into like a vortex of Indian law. But
I'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay, so once upon a time, a bunch of tribes were removed to what was then known as Indian Territory, later became the state of Oklahoma, but they were forcibly removed there, what is now recognized as genocide and like a total violation of international law. But they went there with treaties. Promises that this land will be forever yours and you like don't have to worry about it, establishing by today's standards extremely large Indian reservations. What eventually became the state of Oklahoma assumed that those reservations went away with the statehood of Oklahoma. Nothing ever said that, but they acted like it. And for 100 and some years, that was the case. Oklahoma, for those of you that are familiar or from Oklahoma, know that it was long understood as just little parcels of allotments checkerboarded across the state, little tiny pockets of Indian country, but otherwise largely not. A very mediocre small time criminal case was appealed. I think it was actually like super heinous and horrible. But the public defender argued that the state of Oklahoma doesn't have jurisdiction because this is actually Indian country, see the treaty. It felt like a spaghetti on the wall type of argument, but God darn it, it went to the Supreme Court. And there, Justice Gorsuch famously authored the line, at the end of the Trail of Tears, there was a promise. One of the most exciting pro-tribal Indian law decisions I've ever read in my lifetime. It was cool, but it was actually a very small decision. All it said was that the treaty says that this is an Indian reservation. Congress has plenary power. They could do whatever they want. They could delete this Indian reservation at any time. However, they haven't done it yet. And until they say it, this is an Indian reservation. That decision, while doctrinally, like legally, it didn't do anything, right? Like it's barely going to make a casebook. It exploded in California, in Oklahoma. It turned the state into Indian country overnight. Super cool. Oklahoma is pissed. They hate this decision, specifically their governor, and have literally made war on tribes ever since. This has included, they have made over 200 petitions to the Supreme Court for all sorts of crap. It's extremely hostile. One of the things they argued was that, okay, fine, if McGirt, and they really tried to overturn McGirt, but if McGirt is the law, then we need to change Indian law. And so it has been a long-standing principle that when in Indian country, you have left the state. You're now in Indian country and the laws of the tribes apply. That also means largely like the federal laws too, but it means no state law. And so if a non-Indian victimizes an Indian, then they're subject to federal law. They may be subject to tribal law. There's a whole body of ugly case law that really limits tribal authority, and there's a lot of advocacy to try and get that. But you're not in the state anymore. And that goes all the way back to an 1831 decision involving the Cherokee called Wooster v. Georgia. In the Castro Huerta versus Oklahoma decision, Justice Kavanaugh turned that upside down and said, Oklahoma, we agree with you. The law now changes. You're no longer exclusively an Indian country. Everybody knows at some point in the 1800s, and that's what he says. He says sometime in the 1800s. He's like totally making it up. He basically says the tribes were conquered and that the tribes are now in a state. And so it's narrow in the sense that the decision holds that states can now prosecute non-Indians if they victimize an Indian. But the reasoning of the decision is extremely problematic, suggesting that tribes have much smaller jurisdiction than they actually have, and that conversely, states have much larger jurisdiction than they have. So this is problematic, certainly from a criminal jurisdiction standpoint, super problematic for Oklahoma. It was bad for all Indian country because the decision was not exclusive to Muskogee Creek or even Oklahoma. It was for the whole country. But from a reproductive justice standpoint, it's extremely problematic because now we find ourselves in a world where states are passing criminal bans on abortion, meaning that not only could one be criminally liable for accessing abortion care or for, quote, aiding and abetting someone to access abortion care in the state, but that criminal prohibition could extend to tribal lands, circumventing tribal law and exposing people on tribal lands to that really punitive framework.
That's all I can say. All right. So I have an example here of the GOP chairman, former Congressman Steve Pierce. He's the GOP chairman here in New Mexico. My dad used to be on tribal council. He was also a staff officer for our village. And you know, some of the stories that he told me about tribes working with Republican electeds was when I was a young organizer, I was just like, oh my God, how could they? But it took me years to understand why and the importance of trusting in tribal leadership, even if we don't agree. But yeah, some tribal leaders really liked working with this dude. He was very accommodating. He picked up his phone. His staff were incredibly responsive to tribes and their staff when they called and wanted a meeting. Obviously, he's a white dude, Republican, oil and gas guy. And so the question I have for folks is, what does this working relationship say about tribes' complicated relationship with the federal government? I'm going to leave that to you all. I just really want folks to critically think beyond this two-party system and how it's impacting tribes and the decisions that they make, the decisions that tribes make and some of the limitations. Okay, so someone, oh, okay, you're typing an answer. Yeah, I know we want to get to like, what can we do? What are the next steps? But supporting Indigenous Women Rising's work, and I think largely the work of protecting reproductive health across the country, is really understanding at least the complicated relationships specifically that our tribal communities have to navigate at the federal level and at the state level and the local level. And tribes are much, much smaller than the federal government, than the state government. Hell, even smaller than a state agency. Not every tribe has a 3-branch system. Laguna Pueblo has a 3-branch governing system. They have the governor's office, tribal council, which is the legislative, and then they have their own tribal courts. Navajo Nation, they have a very, very similar setup to the federal government and have agencies dedicated to like housing and infrastructure and gaming.
I just want to plug for Navajo. They also have a human rights commission that entertains petitions of human rights violations and are building a really interesting body of human rights law under Navajo law that I think is fascinating, but I also think is a really important vehicle that I think this group should keep in mind as we consider how to build more robust reproductive justice type frameworks within an Indigenous realm.
Yeah. And the way that we approach our work is very different than our sibling organizations like the National Network of Abortion Funds or the Arizona Abortion Fund. Those are some of our biggest allies. And over the years, one of the things I appreciate most about a lot of these, especially abortion funds, is their willingness to learn and incorporate our perspective. Even though I have this education and I went to school to understand this, there's still so much I don't know. And it's not reasonable for me to expect my community members to know what I know, because of the quote unquote ivory tower, right? And it's always super helpful for me to have someone do these kinds of teach-ins with, because it really sets the stage for letting allies and other Native folks know that these relationships and our involvement in something like abortion access is very political. It comes with its very unique set of barriers, and we have to constantly, just like tribes, be like de facto lawyers, not practicing, but like have to understand federal law and state law and administrative rules and how to conduct ourselves and the decorum when we go into these government spaces. Yeah, so just keeping in mind that organizing with Indigenous folks comes with a unique set of barrier or challenges. And Indigenous women rising is like, we're pretty good at it. And so again, we're just trying to share this information to show how we do the work that we do. Because these are things that we have to keep in mind. And we're 10 years in and we're obviously doing something right. Some stats on our population first. So as I mentioned earlier, 2020 census showed there's a 27.1 increase in the AIAN population, which stands for American Indian / Alaska Native population since the census in 2010. The states with the largest Native populations in 2020: Alaska, Oklahoma, New Mexico, South Dakota, Montana, North Dakota, Arizona, Wyoming. Out of all of these states, only one state on this list has a Democratic majority for the state legislature, and that is New Mexico. It sucks. That's the landscape, but just keep in mind, like in New Mexico, abortion can be sought in any trimester. There are no limits on abortion access here. I'm really grateful for the political climate here, but our relatives in these other states don't have those kinds of protections. These a lot of times are very much red states, and I actually have a few fun tidbits I want to share with folks on this. Alaska. No, not Alaska. In Oklahoma. In Oklahoma's legislature, there are 8 Democratic senators and 20 Democratic House representatives. 8 Dems in the Senate, 20 Dems in the House. There are 40 Republicans in the Senate and 81 Republicans in the House. And this is at the state level. So considering what Lauren was just talking about with this court case, and tribal sovereignty, like the state legislatures also hold a lot of power. So there's a very unique walking a tightrope relationship that tribes have to be mindful of. On abortion, 11 abortion-related ballot measures in 2024. All of those 11 states have state or federally recognized tribes. In conservative or red states, federal recognition is generally not supported, a lot of times because of the tribal consultation that is required by federal law. Did you want to add anything, Lauren?
No.
Okay. All right, let's get to the election. Hold on. Oh, thank you. Someone said, thank you for sharing this information in layman's terms. Yeah, they need to teach this in K through 12. Uh, just like a little side story, the day after the election, I talked to my daughter, she's 12, she's in 7th grade. She's been in politics with me since she was born. Like I made calls with her and knocked on doors with her when she was a baby. And so I, she's a really good practice on like how to make this as easy to understand as possible. And on the day after election day, she was crying and saying like, this feels so hopeless. And I was like, baby girl, there's so much to be hopeful for despite the presidential election. And I'm going to do my very best to explain it to you. So I'm very heartened to hear that. Thank you. Okay. Okay, who won? This freaking fool. I love cats, so this cat is gonna vomit on Donald Trump. Why did that tool win? Short answer, there is no short answer. Okay, there are political pundits all over the country, all over the world who are like, Kamala didn't do this. He was really great at this, and the voters weren't there. They were there. Or there are so many different answers that have been picked apart ad nauseum. They will continue to be picked apart ad nauseum. But there's no short answer. Here are just a few of the takeaways that I have. Before I get into those, first and foremost, there are so many reasons we have for why he won. And for the most part, a lot of them are very valid. There can be multiple truths at once, and there is no one right way or wrong way. Again, this is our analysis of why the election went the way that it went. And it's not going to be on the backs of third-party voters, people who did not vote, or people who have spoken up against Vice President Kamala Harris. Do not blame those people. And us. I did vote for her. It didn't feel very good. And I have my reasons why. And as an organization, Indigenous Women Rising has to look at, the history of how our people are treated or not treated. And again, this comes from our political analyses and us having conversations together, but we will not blame this loss on those folks. Do not use Trump's win to berate Muslim relatives. There are a lot of Muslim folks who tried really hard to go the right way, to use the right words, to be as polite as fucking possible, especially in the uncommitted movement, to get candidates to talk about Palestine. So we're not going to berate them. They went through all the avenues that liberals wanted them to go through, and they still weren't heard. Also, fun fact, if folks didn't know, there were no Palestinian Americans at the DNC, or the Democratic National Committee, when Kamala was officially nominated as the Democratic candidate. Every other marginalized group was, except for Palestinian Americans, who deserve to have a voice up there. Activist LGBTQ relatives were not going to stoop low and pick apart people's identities in order to justify why Kamala lost. I know there's a lot of fear and anger, but hopefully some of the numbers that I'm going to show you can help you connect all of these things. Yeah, it can be overwhelming in knowing where to start, but we're gonna have the information and also a lot more gathering. So I'm really excited to hear people's ideas. So just a few things, not enough time for the vice president to campaign, I don't think. Democratic candidate was handpicked by the president, and that process did not go through the regular route. 19 million fewer people voted in 2024 than 2020. 1.9 fewer people voted for Trump. 13.3 million fewer people voted for Harris than Biden. So 13.3 million people more voted for Biden. Too much time courting centrist Republicans, again, my political expert opinion, than listening to the majority of Americans on Gaza or and embracing the Cheneys, who are like very pro-war. The war in Gaza and the Cheneys, like those are inextricably linked, and says a lot about Israel's statehood, their right to statehood, and the pattern of investments in war that the United States has across the globe. I really don't think Democrats are great at getting organized or being inclusive. Democrats as a party are definitely not awesome at fulfilling campaign promises. For example, if we're going to focus specifically on reproductive health, we heard that abortion would be more protected under the Biden administration. We didn't see a whole lot with the Hyde Amendment. We didn't see a whole lot of executive orders.
Does everyone know what the Hyde Amendment is?
Can you tell us what the Hyde Amendment is?
Small little detour on like where reproductive rights are, just like on the dot, like leading up to Dobbs real quick. Roe v. Wade is this important Supreme Court decision that held that abortion is a fundamental right as part of the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, which applies to all the states after the Civil War. And so it says, right, everyone's entitled to due process, and they held as a component of due process, everyone has a right to privacy. Roe v. Wade holds as a component to privacy, you have a right to get an abortion if you want to. So that's the law of the land. Immediately after Roe v. Wade, a number of members of Congress were really upset about the decision, including a Congressman Hyde. And he is able to successfully initiate what's known as the Hyde Amendment. And this can't do anything about Roe because Congress doesn't have the power to undo a fundamental right unless they amend the Constitution. But he says, we don't have to fund it. And so the Hyde Amendment prohibits any federal dollars from being spent on abortion care. Now, for most Americans, that doesn't matter because we either have private insurance or are accessing healthcare some other way. For Medicaid patients, however, this is a big deal because their healthcare is federally funded. For veterans that are accessing their healthcare through the VA, this is a big deal because their healthcare is federally funded. And for Indians, this is a big deal if you're accessing your healthcare through Indian Health Service. Indian Health Service since 1977 has been prohibited by the Hyde Amendment from spending any dollars on abortion care, with very small exceptions for rape and incest and sexual, just rape incest and I think the life of the mother. Extremely narrow exceptions that it turns out even those are rarely enforced. So for Native Americans, Roe lasted about 5 minutes, but Native Americans have effectively been living in a non-Roe world ever since. Dobbs comes out and Dobbs overturns the Roe decision and says, we were wrong. This is actually not a fundamental right. Evidenced in part because at the time of when the Constitution's drafting, there were lots of abortion restrictions, and so it wasn't considered fundamental back then. Hard to see why that's relevant now, but that's their reasoning. And so they effectively say, look, we should leave it to the states to decide whether or not abortions should be restricted, which is a cute sentiment, except for tribes because of the Castro Huerta decision. Tribes as governments, under this reasoning in Dobbs, should have the authority to decide for themselves how abortion should be regulated or protected, but are denied that sovereign right because states can encroach on that authority by implementing their own restriction that applies on tribal lands. plus the Hyde Amendment, which is totally bunkers because Indian Health Service is not provided as an act of grace to tribes. It is an obligation that the federal government has to tribes to fulfill treaty and other promises made to tribes in exchange for land secessions. This is a debt that the federal government owes tribes and is currently under fulfilling that debt, both because IHS is like crazy underfunded, but also because they're prohibited from fulfilling abortion care.
Essentially, fuck the Hyde Amendment. Yeah, so there are.
It's, I'm so sorry to
No,
harp
no,
on
no,
it,
please,
but
please.
it's really crazy because the Hyde Amendment was implemented as just like a tantrum by Congress over Roe. But the disproportionality with which Native people and veterans and poor people under Medicare are forced to experience the brunt of that makes it extremely galling, and I think is emblematic of like congressional sort of ineptitude to address that is really, really telling.
Just fund it. Oh my God. Yeah, that's our analysis of the Democrats. They kind of suck. Since the founding of the country and the times election polls closed, like I thought, I don't know if other folks have ever thought of this, but in my analysis as an expert, I kind of feel like nationwide elections are determined by the East Coast and Midwest. Time zones, right? And who gets counted first. And remember, I said that the census and redistricting can impact how many seats in Congress a state has. They can decrease, they can increase over time. And so that can really impact people's representation in Congress. There's a reason for the saying no taxation with representation. And unfortunately, like a lot of these states on the East Coast, Midwest, the South or Southeast, because they are so populated, the electoral votes are also connected. And so who has the most electoral votes, right? New Mexico, for example, has 5, and it's based on, I believe it's based on your representation in Congress, right? In both chambers.
That's exactly right. And so a state like Wyoming, which is the smallest population, has guaranteed, I believe, 3 electoral votes. But the more people you have, the more electoral votes you have, which sort of makes sense, but doesn't quite get us to like a majority vote, which is why in past presidential elections, we've had phenomena where a president like Bush, and even Trump may get the majority electoral votes, but still lose the popular election.
Mm-hmm. And in my expert opinion, I feel like this setup, the Electoral College, it disenfranchises so many people west of the Mississippi, especially where like in New Mexico and Arizona, we do have huge native populations. And also, again, the amount of electoral votes we have matters and it doesn't. For example, in the 2020 election, Arizona was considered a battleground state. This year, it was assumed it would be a battleground state, but it wasn't. So, I mean, I think that's one of the many examples of how some states west of the Mississippi can be flipped, or they're not always reliable like battleground states. And then there are some states like California, where they do have a winner take all state is like reliably blue. So okay, so again, no short answer. I just wanted to put a few numbers together. In 2020, Biden received 306 electoral votes. and he won compared to Trump, who currently has 295 and won. Because they call it the race to 270, so you have to have at least 270 electoral votes to be the next president. Trump had 232, and he won more electoral votes and still lost than Kamala Harris did. Biden won the popular vote, 81 million. Trump also won the popular vote and the electoral college, but he won significantly less in the popular vote than Biden did, and he won. And then I just put a little note that Nevada has 91% reporting, and Arizona has, oh, it was like 69% reporting. Sorry, I forgot to put that in. 69% reporting.
You're such a great pundit.
Thank you. Steve Kornacki, move over.
I just want to flag, I am so sorry. I'm going to have to leave in about 5 minutes, and I deeply apologize.
Okay, in the 5 minutes, can you give some like inspirational shit for people?
Well, we've talked about this before, and it's really shaped my thinking on all of this. And I don't want to suggest that this is what you're implying if it's not, but part of my take is like, right, like, okay, this is truly awful, right? We have a candidate, now president-elect, who openly talks about wanting to take on the trappings of a fascist dictator. That doesn't sound great. That he openly wants to seek retribution on people who haven't pledged loyalty. That he openly assaults people, including sexually assaults people. I don't love any of that. But I also know that indigenous communities have survived much worse. President Jackson, who is a personal hero of President Trump, his entire campaign was the annihilation of indigenous people, and he was celebrated, and apparently continues to be celebrated. And indigenous people persevered. Much of my research is about looking at, how do we understand tribal sovereignty, and it's built on this history in which throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, it was assumed that Native people were going to go away. They were going to die out, and they were going to be absorbed into the American population. That the tribal people would actively abandon their tribes for the opportunity to join the United States. And that just didn't happen. And those times were so much darker. And so to me, like, this is not ideal, but it's also easy. This is easy peasy. The last Trump administration was, I think, arguably outside of like all the crazy national stuff, but specifically for Indian country, it was mixed. We saw a hostile Department of Interior, right? Like we currently have Secretary Haaland at the Department of Interior. Like we're not going to have that. We had an extremely hostile EPA. But we also had an administration that was very agnostic about tribes, and really did not make tribes a priority, which frankly can be kind of an advantage. It can be nice to not be in the limelight. 4 tribes were recognized under the Trump administration. 0 tribes have been recognized under the Biden administration. We saw increased funding to tribes, including under the Department of Justice under the Trump administration. And so I think it's going to be really hard. I think that it requires us to fortify and to dig up energy that I don't know where I'm going to get it. But I also know that's what we do. That's what we specialize in. And I think the rest of the country is in a real pickle. I think that this is a big fat problem for the United States. But for tribes, I think it's okay. I think we're going to be just fine.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I appreciate your expertise as always. always offering that legal perspective and pushing me to think more critically about what's in front of me. So thank you.
For what it's worth, you're a rock star. Indigenous Women Rising is amazing, and I look to it. And for all of the attendees, I am, of course, saddened by the clunky nature of Zoom that we aren't able to interact anymore. But I hope you consider me as a resource and reach out. I'll put my email in here real quick, but it's publicly available. And I really look forward to fighting with all of you. Thank you. And Rachel, thank you so much for hosting this and for providing this space. It's incredibly restorative in a moment that I was starting to like be dramatic. And this like brought me back down to earth, and I appreciate it.
Yes, well, we can be dramatic in a good way.
Yeah.
All right, go take care of your family. Do what you got to do. Take care of yourself.
Buenas noches.
All righty. No, it's just me. Sorry, guys. Okay. So I put battleground states in like a quotation mark and some quotation marks. Because this is what they were called by the national pundits, right? They're battleground states. I just wanted to put the popular vote of whoever won that state. So Michigan, Trump won 3,600 more votes than Biden did in 2020. North Carolina, Trump received 118,000 votes more than in 2020. Now, I really, just to kind of drive home how much of a missed opportunity the Democrats had in regards to Gaza. Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman, won re-election, right? She won re-election with 78.1% of the vote in 2020 and 69.7% of the vote this week. She's actually in District 13 now, not the 12th district. I'm so sorry about that, but or maybe it was flipped. But she represents the district is different. And again, that's because of redistricting. And so part of what I noticed in the numbers is that she has significantly more, I think it was like over 200,000 more of the vote in 2024 than she did in 2020. So even though the percentage is lower than in 2020, she actually got more votes this year than 2020. I think that's incredibly significant to keep in mind. She has been one of the very few Congress people who has been very vocal about sending arms to Israel or to Palestine to kill Palestinians. And she also represents a huge Muslim community. Michigan is home to Muslim families from all over the world. And Kamala Harris still lost that state, which had been reliably blue up until 2020. Two chambers of Congress and Native folks. Again, this is my analysis. I don't think representation always matters. I'm gonna put the, no, shoot. I will put it in the chat. Copy. Paste. So this is a spreadsheet that Polly Dinette-Claw, who is Diné or Navajo, from Indian Country Today, put together. It's every single Indigenous candidate for offices up and down the ballot, whether they won or lost, what tribe they're from, their party affiliation, their gender. And so we have 21 Republicans who ran for federal office, 93 Democrats. There are currently 2 Republicans in Congress and 3 Republicans lost. One of them is Yvette Harrell here in New Mexico. We have 1 Democrat in Congress, Charisse, and 4 Democrats lost. Jonathan Nez, who is Diné, who is running for the second House district in Arizona, not reported yet. They're still counting those votes. Down ballot races and Native folks. Again, just a shout out to Polly and all of the incredible work that she does in Native media. Please keep in mind for tribes, many times the party doesn't matter. Tribes need to consider who will do best to advocate for their interests, including tribal gaming and taxation. Lauren talked about that earlier in the call. Education, healthcare, judicial appointments, land management, and tribal consultation. What did the presidential campaign not do very great? I think, because I saw, tribes in our communities are always an afterthought, unfortunately. There were not enough visits to reservations. We saw the vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz, at Navajo Nation. That could have been done a long time ago. No mention of protecting tribal sovereignty on her website. And then I have a document. I didn't know I wasn't going to be able to like, oh no, I can. Okay, sick. So copy, paste. So here's a PDF if you can like just copy and paste it into your browser. This is like a really long, wordy document that is not easily accessible or readable to folks who would have absolutely appreciated knowing what her stance is on tribal sovereignty. If you look at the page that was generally accessible on her website, you will not find tribal sovereignty. Native votes are valuable, but not valuable enough to engage beyond presidential and midterm elections. Let's be very honest about that. And this is a quick note on tribal endorsements. One of the Native Republicans from Muskogee, who was on the election night news coverage with me, he made a point that I don't have an opinion on quite yet, but I just thought it was really important to share with y'all, that he has the opinion that tribes should not endorse presidential candidates because if the person they endorse loses, it could potentially make it politically difficult for that tribe to engage with the presidential administration when they're doing their government to government duties, and they're trying to hold the federal government accountable to their federal trust responsibilities. So I wanted to bring that up. We're almost there, I promise. Here's this little bunny who is like, if you need a break, take a break. What does this mean and what are we saying? Support tribes in your state, please. Like that's really all we're really asking for. Don't assume you understand tribal governance. All tribes are different. We currently have like 400 or 500 federally recognized tribes, doesn't include state recognized tribes, doesn't include tribal communities that are fighting for recognition. And that means that you have tribes with priorities that are very different. Research what the Hyde Amendment is and how it connects to Indian Health Services. I think Lauren gave a great synopsis on how they impact each other. I really encourage, especially non-Native folks, to do some research on both of those and kind of formulate your own analysis. We're saying that for over 500 years, we've been through this. So please look to us for collaborative solutions. It's not going to happen like this. It doesn't. Our timelines as Native people are very different than non-Native folks. There are so many other things we have to consider, like our culture, our religion, our land, maybe even our clan systems, the time of the year, harvest season, the summertime. There are so many other things outside of politics that we have to consider, and that these solutions can take time, but we really want allies to become accomplices and take that kind of time and intentionality into your understanding when you get really angry and want something done like ASAP. The solutions are not always going to be voting. So please do not limit your civic engagement to voting or sharing something on social media. Of course, if you have certain disabilities and like, we really appreciate social media. Everyone has a place, and that's like one of the easiest things to do, but I really encourage folks to read, to participate in teach-ins, to organize your own teach-in, to invite us, IWR. We're not going to charge you. Like, invite us to come to your webinar or do a teach-in. We'd be more than happy to do that. Liberation is a marathon and transcends government structures. We are not going to be free just because someone's in the presidential office, right? Or the person we want is in office at any level, right? All we have is each other, and we are the ones who are going to free each other. Again, representation isn't everything. Just because I don't think that Kamala was the right choice doesn't mean I wanted Trump to win. Absolutely not. Moving to another country, I've heard this so much. It's just more colonization, and frankly, I think that's gross. Does that country even want you there? The country, Ireland has said, you know, Americans after the election, if you are planning on moving there, like, are you prepared to face violence from the rest of the United Kingdom, Britain in particular? Like, they are very, and from Israel, they are very pro-Palestine. So just like keep that in mind. Like, do you really want to like continue that violent legacy of colonization? And why are you why is it appropriate, do you think, to abandon Indigenous communities to clean up the mess and then disenfranchise us when we start showing that our methods have results? Why abandon us in this fight to protect the land and things that we really love by moving away and taking your resources with you when we really need each other? Indigenous people and our needs must always be at the center of policy. No more us being an afterthought, whether it's policy, community organizing, a teach-in. I'm tired of being an afterthought. I'm tired of my community and my people being an afterthought. It's not right. This is our land, and the fact that we are afterthoughts on our own land is frankly like incredibly disrespectful and sickening. Indian Country Today, which is a Native-led and run media network, found that the top 4 issues for tribes are respecting tribal sovereignty, again, not present on either candidate's website, tribal economies, beyond gaming, tribal infrastructure, roads, housing, and the environment and sacred sites, which directly ties into like Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management. I highly recommend people do research on your state's land office and your public lands commissioner. I was trying to find a poop emoji. Do not shit on natives who are conservative. We have an incredibly complicated history with colonizer governments for survival. For example, during the Trump administration, Ivanka Trump created a task force for missing and murdered Indigenous women. Some tribes were like, oh, it's like just for show, whatever. I don't know what power this task force really has, but some tribes did engage, and they found it really helpful to gain access to the president, and it helped them in other endeavors beyond missing and murdered Indigenous women. So again, our needs transcend parties, and all tribes have different opinions. So I'm just asking y'all to think about like the history of natives fighting for sovereignty so we can have a say over our own lands and our own families, and not totally judging our relationship with the federal government. And Native people were all walking a tightrope in a white man's world. But what will IWR do? We'll continue to fund abortion, whether or not abortion is legal in a state or there's a national ban, we will fund abortion. Abortion's not a dirty word. We need everyone, including cishet men, to care about abortion, to talk about abortion, to support abortion, birthing needs, and menstrual hygiene. We're gonna fund all of it. Sexual reproductive health, the aiding and abetting abortion, we'll do it. For me, yes, there is a legal risk, but I'm willing to take it because I believe so much in abortion access. More opportunities to get involved in our events and community conversations online and in person. I am planning some trainings to show you how to talk about the disparities that we face and how to use your platform to advance our mission. The New Mexico legislature in 2025, it's a long session, so it's going to be 3 months or 90 days. We're going to get rowdy. You're going to see a lot of cool stuff, and we're going to show the rest of the country we can have fun, we can be informed, and we really do know how to get shit done. What can you do for like the first time ever? Oh no. Can you volunteer with us, please? Yes. For the first time ever, we're going to start launching a volunteer form. So here it is. Fill it out. You can volunteer with us or with other abortion funds. Donate to us or other abortion funds. You could also donate to tribes, organize your own teach-ins or join them. Push your local schools and institutions to include more Indigenous scholarship and fiction. Sorry, I'm posting all these links in the chat. Ensure local Indigenous folks are part of your events. Like if you're having an event here in New Mexico, like invite people from that community to like be engaged and not just give a land acknowledgement, which frankly I'm rolling my eyes at nowadays, or to give like an opening prayer, but like include us in your agenda, include us in whatever you have going on, and invite us and pay us to do a teach-in or to do a workshop, even if it has nothing to do with the topic of your conference or whatever. Like we really want to share our skills with y'all, but it's not really fair to ask like, what more can we do if like you don't reach out to us? So joining this webinar tonight is a really good first step. So thank you. And also have fun. My husband was like, I was like, what inspirational stuff should I say at the end? Like, what can people do? He was like, have fun. Native people really are the funniest people. I think I said that on election night when I was on TV. Like we really are the funniest people, and we really couldn't have survived violent colonization without humor. And we want to be able to share our hope and our hopes and dreams with folks. And I don't mean that in like, I mean, I do mean it in a silly way, and I'm also very serious about it because times are tough. They're gonna get harder. But that doesn't mean we give up. That doesn't mean we abandon each other and start pointing fingers. That means we take time to rest. That means we literally start pulling up a Google Doc and making a list of all the organizations that we love and start researching. Do they need volunteers? Do they need someone to help fundraise with them? Do they have positions open? I really believe in the sentiment, think globally, act locally. So please, like, don't lose hope. I know it's frustrating and sad, and I cried over margaritas on election night, but I'm also feeling really hopeful. 60 people signed up for this webinar, 32 people showed up, and 26 people are on right now. That means so much to me. That means that 26 people gave up a Thursday night to listen to me ramble on about politics, and a very brief analysis. I really don't think 2 hours is enough to really go in depth about abortion, electoral politics, and what we're seeing across the country. This is just a very brief debrief of of how we're seeing this, and this webinar was kind of pulled together. What if they come off and start attacking personally though? Kick their ass, duh. Let's see. Someone asked, do you have an idea or opinion as to why less people voted this year? I have so many opinions. I think one of them, of course, is voter suppression. I think the courts and a lot of secretaries of state really, especially in conservative states or in states that went to Biden in 2020, I think their secretaries of state did everything they could to suppress Black folks from voting and any other marginalized communities. They really restricted voting locations, voting times, the distance that people have to travel, identification requirements. 11 states across the country refuse to use tribal IDs as a valid form of identification for voting. So there are so many reasons why less people voted. And I also think just general political exhaustion. And all of those things can be true at once. I know I was answering questions throughout the thing. I'm gonna take a risk here. Please text me or email me, like lean into your curiosity. Again, IWR is here to be with you, to share what we know, to do a more in-depth analysis. Again, this was just a quick debrief. 2 hours is not enough time. If you have specific questions or ideas you want me to cover in future webinars, because I'm thinking I'm going to do these a lot more often. I think this is the second one I've done in a year. I want to do these much more often and make sure that people have the information that they need. So please text me or email me. Sure, allow. Okay, I know you guys all put questions, or you folks all put questions in there, but let me just show you my kitty cat. This kitty cat on here, not anything else. This cat with the glasses. Okay, thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Stephanie and Nona and anonymous attendees and Christine, everyone who answered questions. Please keep an eye out in your email for future opportunities. Please sign up to volunteer. Even if you're not in New Mexico, we are definitely going to have opportunities to volunteer with us and make shit happen. All right. Have a good night, everyone. And yeah, it's not over. It's not over. We have each other. Okay, bye.